The rain was coming down in sheets when the silver sedan pulled up to the curb. It was one of those nights where the city felt cold and indifferent, the kind of night where you just wanted to be home behind a locked door. My name is Elena, and at that moment, I had no idea that stepping into that car would change my life forever. The driver was a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that seemed to be constantly checking the rearview mirror. He did not say a word as I got in. He just nodded and started the engine. For the first 5 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers against the glass. I leaned my head against the cold window, watching the neon signs of the city blur into streaks of light. Then, without warning, the driver slowed down. He took a sharp turn into a side street that was not on the GPS route. My heart gave a small thud of anxiety. I asked him if there was a construction delay. He did not answer me. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a secondary cell phone. He did not look back at me. He just held the phone over his shoulder, his hand trembling slightly. He told me to take the phone. He told me to call the first number in the contacts and tell whoever answered that I was safe. I froze. I asked him what was going on. His voice was a ragged whisper that barely carried over the sound of the rain. He told me to pretend I knew him. He said that we were being followed by a black SUV that had been behind us since the airport. I looked out the back window. Far behind us, 2 bright headlights were cutting through the gloom, keeping a perfectly consistent distance. The driver told me his name was Marcus. He said that if I wanted to live through the night, I had to play along. He told me that the people in that car were not police and they were not looking for a fare. They were looking for him, and now that I was in his car, they were looking for me too. I took the phone with shaking fingers. My thumb hovered over the screen. I did not know who Marcus was or why he was being hunted, but the sheer terror in his voice was more convincing than any explanation he could have given. I pressed the call button. The line clicked open almost immediately. A woman's voice answered, sounding sharp and urgent. She asked if it was done. I looked at the back of Marcus's head. He caught my eye in the mirror and gave a tiny, desperate nod. I cleared my throat and tried to keep my voice from cracking. I told her that I was safe and that I was with my Uncle Marcus. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the sound of heavy breathing. The woman finally spoke again, telling me to stay on the line and not to hang up no matter what happened. Marcus accelerated suddenly, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. He told me to duck down. He said they were getting closer. I slid off the seat and onto the floorboards, the smell of old floor mats and stale coffee filling my nose. I could hear the roar of a much larger engine gaining on us. The hunt had begun, and I was trapped in the middle of a war I did not understand. Marcus began to weave through the narrow alleyways of the industrial district, the car jolting as we hit potholes. He was driving like a man possessed. He told me that he was sorry for dragging me into this. He said he was a witness to something that should have stayed buried. He had spent 10 years running, but his luck had finally run out. He told me that the phone in my hand contained the only evidence that could stop the people behind us. He said that if we did not make it to the drop-off point, I had to make sure the world saw what was on that device. I felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. I was just a woman trying to get home from a business trip, and now I was holding a digital death warrant. The black SUV rammed our bumper, sending a violent jolt through the car. My head hit the back of the front seat, and spots danced in my eyes. Marcus roared in frustration and slammed his foot on the gas. He told me to hold on tight. We were headed toward the old bridge, and he did not plan on stopping for anyone. The impact of the second collision was even louder than the first. Metal groaned against metal as the black SUV tried to fishtail us into the concrete barrier. Marcus was a master behind the wheel, fighting the steering wheel with every ounce of his strength. He told me to stay down and stay quiet. The woman on the phone was still there, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos. She told me to look for a blue folder under the passenger seat. I reached out, my fingers brushing against cold plastic. I pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. Marcus glanced back, his face pale under the streetlights. He told me that the envelope was the key. It contained the physical coordinates and the names of the men who were currently trying to kill us. He told me that the man driving the SUV behind us was someone he used to call a brother. It was a betrayal that went deeper than I could imagine. We were nearing the entrance to the bridge now. The lights of the suspension cables looked like a ribcage of a giant beast against the black sky. Marcus told me that once we hit the bridge, there would be nowhere left to turn. He had a plan, but it was dangerous. He asked me if I trusted him. I looked into his eyes through the mirror. I saw a man who was exhausted, terrified, but fundamentally honest. I told him I had no other choice. He smiled weakly and told me that was the right answer. The SUV pulled alongside us, the tinted windows hiding the faces of the pursuers. A window rolled down, and, for a split second, I saw the glint of steel. Marcus slammed on the brakes. The SUV surged ahead, overshooting us. Marcus pulled a hard U-turn, his tires smoking even in the rain. We were now driving the wrong way against traffic. Cars honked and swerved, their headlights blinding me. My heart was in my throat. Every second felt like a minute. Marcus was laughing now, a manic sound born of pure adrenaline. He told me that the people following us were part of a shadow organization that had infiltrated the highest levels of the city government. They used rideshare apps to track their targets, which is why he had hijacked this specific car. He wasn't an Uber driver. He was a whistleblower who had stolen the car to blend in. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just in a dangerous situation. I was in the company of a fugitive. But as I looked back, the black SUV had managed to turn around and was coming at us head-on. Marcus told me to brace for impact. He didn't swerve. He headed straight for them. At the last possible second, he jerked the wheel to the right, crashing through a temporary construction fence and onto a dirt path leading toward the docks. The car bounced violently, throwing me against the door. Marcus yelled for me to get out as soon as the car stopped. He said he would distract them while I ran for the ferry. I told him I wouldn't leave him. He turned to me, his expression softening for the first time. He told me that I was the only witness left who wasn't compromised. He shoved the phone and the envelope into my hands. He told me to run and not to look back. The car skidded to a halt near the edge of the dark water. The headlights of the SUV were already swinging around the corner. I opened the door and felt the freezing rain hit my face. Marcus looked at me and told me to go. I started running. My heels sank into the mud, and I tripped, scraping my palms. I could hear the heavy doors of the SUV opening behind me. I didn't look back. I ran toward the shadows of the shipping containers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the night, followed by the sound of breaking glass. I ducked behind a massive steel crate, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was alone in the dark, hunted by shadows, holding the only thing that could bring them down. I huddled in the darkness, the cold metal of the shipping container pressing against my back. Every drop of rain hitting the ground sounded like a footstep. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to silence the roaring in my ears. I could hear voices now. They were low and professional, moving with a terrifying efficiency. They weren't shouting, they were hunting. I looked at the phone Marcus had given me. The screen was still glowing faintly. The woman was still on the line. She whispered my name. She told me to look for a small red light on the horizon. That was the ferry, and it was leaving in 5 minutes. She told me that if I missed that boat, there would be no way off the island. I looked out across the water. The ferry was there, a flickering ghost in the fog. But between me and the dock lay 100 yards of open ground. I could see the flashlights of the men in the SUV cutting through the rain. They were systematic, checking every corner, every shadow. I realized then that Marcus was gone. I didn't know if he was dead or captured, but I knew I was on my own. I looked at the envelope in my hand. The red wax seal seemed to glow in the dark. I wondered what kind of secrets were worth all this blood. I remembered the way Marcus had looked at me. He had sacrificed everything to give me a chance. I couldn't let that be for nothing. I waited until the flashlights moved toward the far side of the warehouse. Then I moved. I stayed low, crawling through the mud and the grease of the docks. My clothes were ruined, and my hands were numb with cold, but the adrenaline kept me going. I reached the edge of the last shipping container and saw the gangplank of the ferry. A lone guard was standing by the gate, checking his watch. He didn't look like the others. He looked like a regular worker. I took a deep breath and tried to smooth my hair. I had to look like a normal passenger who had just been caught in the rain. I stepped out into the light. The guard looked up, surprised. I gave him a tired smile and told him I had almost missed the last boat. He grumbled something about the weather and stepped aside. I walked onto the deck, my legs feeling like lead. As the ferry began to pull away from the dock, I looked back at the shore. The black SUV pulled up to the gate. 3 men got out, their silhouettes sharp against the headlights. One of them looked directly at the boat. Even from this distance, I could feel the coldness of his gaze. I stepped into the cabin, where a few tired commuters were dozing in their seats. I found a corner in the back and sat down, clutching the envelope to my chest. The woman on the phone spoke again. She told me I had done well. She told me to meet her at the lighthouse on the other side of the bay. She said she was Marcus's sister, and she was the only one who could help me now. But as I looked at the phone, I noticed something strange. The contact name wasn't a name at all. It was a series of numbers that looked like a badge ID. A wave of suspicion washed over me. Who was I actually talking to? I opened the envelope, my hands trembling. Inside were dozens of photographs. They weren't of politicians or criminals. They were photographs of me. Pictures of me at the grocery store, at my office, even through my bedroom window. My blood turned to ice. Marcus hadn't picked me up by accident. This wasn't a random ride gone wrong. I had been the target all along. The realization was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. Every word Marcus had said, every moment of the chase, had been a calculated performance. I looked out the window at the dark water. I wasn't escaping. I was being delivered. The lighthouse loomed ahead like a jagged tooth against the stormy sky. The ferry docked with a heavy thud, and I was the first one off. I didn't run this time. I walked with a steady, purposeful gait. The fear was still there, but it had been replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. If Marcus and the woman on the phone were playing a game, I was going to find out the rules. I reached the base of the lighthouse. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of salt and old machinery. A woman was standing by the central pillar, her back to me. She was tall, dressed in a sharp gray suit that looked out of place in this desolate spot. She turned around, and I saw that she had the same eyes as Marcus. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She thanked me for bringing the evidence. She reached out her hand for the envelope. I didn't move. I asked her why she had photos of me. Her smile vanished. She told me that I was a very special person, Elena. She said that my father had been part of their organization long ago, and he had left something behind that only I could unlock. She said the photos were just to ensure they had the right girl. She told me that Marcus was fine, and that he was waiting for us. I looked at the phone in my hand. I told her I knew she wasn't his sister. I told her I knew the phone was tracking my biometric data the whole time. She laughed then, a dry, hollow sound. She told me I was smarter than I looked. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. She said that the world was built on secrets, and I was the biggest secret of all. She told me that if I gave her the envelope, she would let me go back to my normal life. But we both knew that was a lie. Once you see behind the curtain, there is no going back. Suddenly, the door burst open. Marcus stood there, drenched and bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He wasn't holding a weapon, but he looked more dangerous than I had ever seen him. He told the woman to get away from me. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. He told me that everything he said about the chase was true, but he had lied about who he was. He wasn't a whistleblower. He was her brother, but he had turned against the family to protect me. He said he had spent years trying to find a way to get me out without them noticing. The woman hissed at him, calling him a traitor. The tension in the room was a physical force. I looked from the woman to Marcus. I didn't know who to believe. Both of them were part of a world I never wanted to belong to. I looked at the envelope one last time. Then, I walked to the edge of the lighthouse gallery, looking down at the churning waves below. I told them that if either of them moved, the evidence and the phone would go into the ocean. They both froze. I realized then that the power wasn't in the secrets themselves, but in who held them. I told Marcus to give me his car keys. I told the woman to stay where she was. I walked out of that lighthouse and didn't look back. I drove away into the night, the envelope hidden under my seat. I don't know what my future holds, and I don't know if I can ever truly be safe again. But as the sun began to rise over the horizon, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer a passenger in someone else's story. I was the one behind the wheel now, and I was never going to let anyone else drive my life again. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. I was the girl who survived the night, and I was the girl who held the keys to the kingdom.